My Hero Academia, all grown up. Chapter 34. We need everybody to move back. Uraraka heard a policeman shouting orders at the crowd of bystanders while she ducked underneath a long line of caution tape. She was already dreading having to try and get the smell of smoke out of her costume later, but she pushed that thought aside as she spotted a familiar face. Kirishima. She called and jogged across the closed-off street to meet up with the red-haired hero that was helping a few firefighters unkink their fire hose. Once he was finished, he turned to her. "Oh, hey, Uraraka," he gave her a quick grin. "You showed up right on time." "More like late," she muttered as she glanced past him to see a blackened building that was still smoldering inside. The windows had been blown out of the convenience store that she and Bakugou had been staking out a few nights ago, and the entire interior of the building had been reduced to ash. The bricks lining the walls on the exterior were charred and still hot to the touch. He shrugged and followed her gaze. "You didn't miss much. As far as we know, nobody was inside, so search and rescue wasn't really needed." Uraraka sighed as she accepted that their only promising Viper lead had been burned to the ground. What happened? Kirishima glanced over at a group of police officers that were speaking quietly with two heroes that had been patrolling the area when the store went up. Everybody is still trying to figure that out. Those two were the first responders. He pointed at the pair of heroes. Uraraka hummed regretfully. "Well, this really sucks." "You're telling me?" Kirishima nodded and kicked at a pile of ash that had gathered on the pavement. "It's a miracle that they were able to stop the fire before it spread." "It's definitely arson." "Oh, for sure." Uraraka laughed weakly. "Where's Bakugou?" "Inside." He gestured toward the building. "I wouldn't go in, though. The firefighters are still trying to make sure it's out, and they haven't said it's safe to go in yet." "Then why would he go in?" Uraraka shook her head in disbelief. "You know how he is." Kirishima shrugged defeatedly. "He's pretty pissed off right now, so if I were you, I'd steer clear for a bit." "Yeah." Uraraka felt a wave of sadness. It had been a few days since they called things off, and they hadn't spoken much. It was awkward between them at best, but they had managed to put their feelings aside for the time being. They were hyper-focused on the mission, but the destruction of this store felt like a nail in the coffin. Uraraka sniffed hard to try and pull herself together before she turned around to see a large group of bystanders watching the heroes and firemen do their work. Did anybody see what happened? Kirishima glanced back to see her looking at the crowd. "I'm not sure. The police have been getting some statements, so you'll have to ask them." Uraraka didn't reply, but instead meandered back toward the civilians. She stopped on her side of the caution tape before giving a gentle smile to two men that were pointing at the building. "Hello." The man to Uraraka's left blinked and turned his attention on her first. He looked average with black hair and a turtleneck sweater. "Oh, wow. It's you, Ravity." "Yup," her smile grew at the recognition. "I'm trying to gather some information, so if it's not too much trouble, could you tell me what happened?" "Oh." The man on the right shook his head at her. "We weren't here when it happened. We just came to see the heroes." "Bummer," she pouted back. The man on the left looked guilty for having disappointed her. "Well, I mean, we didn't see it, but I think I heard someone talking about it earlier." He glanced behind him to scan the crowd. "Oh, yeah, there she is." Uraraka followed his pointing finger until she spotted the back of a woman's head. "Oh, thank you." She flashed the pair a bright smile before she ducked under the caution tape and pushed through the crowd. The man wearing the turtleneck watched after her. "I think I'm in love." Uraraka smiled to herself as she overheard the comment but pressed forward. The crowd dispersed significantly to let her pass until she was tapping the woman on the shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The woman turned around in surprise, and she was cradling a small child in her arms. She was middle-aged with long hair, but her surprise fell to relief a moment later. "Oh, thank goodness for you heroes. I was worried my apartment building was going to burn down. I'm so glad that it didn't." Uraraka smiled back and then down at the child. "I heard that you might have seen what happened." "Yes," the woman replied exuberantly. "I did. I was on my way to that very store when some sort of explosion went off. I can't tell you how happy I am that I wasn't inside with Junior." Uraraka smiled down at the little boy in her arms. "Me too. Did you happen to see anyone when it happened?" Maybe running away or something. The woman paused to think. No, I don't believe I did. There were a lot of people out and about today, so if there was somebody suspicious, I wouldn't have been able to tell. Uraraka felt her heart sink. Do you know if anyone else here saw what happened? The woman skewed her mouth and looked around. Uraraka followed her gaze as they both scanned the crowd, but the woman simply shook her head. I don't recognize anyone, but I'm sure there are others. Uraraka continued to scan the crowd of bystanders. She caught sight of Kirishima talking with some teenagers close by, and he appeared to be doing the same thing she was. Perhaps he was having better luck. She pressed her knuckles against her hips and turned to look toward the back of the crowd. Her eyes snagged on a figure leaning against a light pole. They had their arms crossed and the hood drawn up on their purple sweatshirt. Something about them felt familiar, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Thank you for your help. Uraraka didn't look back at the woman she'd been speaking to. You should go find a police officer and give them an official statement. It might help you remember something about it that could be helpful. I certainly will. The woman smiled at Uraraka, but the brunette was busy looking at the figure, so she simply nodded her head and left to find an officer. Uraraka watched curiously as the figure stared at the burnt building. Something about them was off. They looked entirely out of place, despite their efforts to look casual. The longer she watched the suspicious person, the better look she got. Her suspicions weren't confirmed until the person turned their hooded face around, unintentionally giving Uraraka a chance to see their face. It was a woman, and Uraraka immediately recognized her. She was the same one that had left the convenience store and walked by when she and Bakugou had staked out the store. She's a villain. Just as Uraraka made a move to intercept, the villain's gaze locked on hers, and there was a long, passive look between them as they both came to official conclusions. Kirishima! Uraraka shouted, not daring to look away from the villain as she immediately began sprinting through the crowd toward her. Hey you! Stop where you are! The villainous woman tensed for a moment, unsure of what to do, before she turned tail and ran at full speed. Uraraka finally broke through the crowd and took off after her, hurtling over the pavement in pursuit. This one could not get away no matter what. She had to catch her. Uraraka followed the villain around a corner and spotted her at the end of the alleyway looking back and forth as if she couldn't decide on a direction. Uraraka propelled herself down the alley with the help of her quirk, but the moment her fingers touched her back, the figure disintegrated like dust and wafted away. What? Uraraka breathed in confusion before the sound of footsteps made her look to the left, and she caught a glimpse of something purple ducking behind another building. There you are. Uraraka took off after her again and catalogued the quirk use. It wasn't a necessarily impressive quirk, but it had fooled her. She wouldn't make that mistake again. By the time she rounded the next corner, the street was filled with lookalikes, and Uraraka halted. Perhaps this quirk was easier said than done. She glazed over them all as she heard Kirishima run up behind her. What's going on? Uraraka motioned to the fake figures. She's running, but she has some sort of illusionary quirk. I'm going up to take a look around. She tapped her fingers against herself before she vaulted up above the buildings. She caught sight of Kirishima punching through the lookalikes, turning each one to dust. Once she was high enough, she glanced around, searching for a purple sweatshirt that matched her villain, but didn't find one. In fact, she couldn't find anyone that looked even remotely in a hurry. Where did she go? Perhaps the villain wasn't running at all. With all the lookalikes around, she could just as easily hide and wait it out after giving the impression that she'd run away. Uraraka had a positive pull in her chest, confirming her gut instincts. She'd need to sweep the buildings. Kirishima, Uraraka called to him once her feet hit the ground. We need to search the shops. She's bound to be hiding in one. Got it. Kirishima nodded and turned to the closest shop, bursting inside. Uraraka turned to the opposite side of the street and pushed it open. The shopkeeper looked surprised to see her. Has anyone come in here within the last 5 minutes? Air. The shopkeeper shook her head softly. Not that I know of. I was in the back until dash. Uraraka didn't wait for her to answer before she began checking down the aisles. Nothing appeared out of place. This shop didn't seem promising, thanks. She turned and exited, hurrying to the next one over. She glanced across the street and found Kirishima doing the same. He hadn't found her either, and Uraraka desperately hoped that her hunch was correct. She shoved into the next shop and did the same, demanding information from the employees and checking through the aisles and behind the counters. Nothing. Crap. This hunch was beginning to fester with doubt. The radio on her belt crackled before Kirishima's voice came through. I think I've got her. Uraraka felt elated as she ran out of the shop and across the street. She threw open the shop door and rushed inside. Where is she? In here. Kirishima pointed to a closed door. Someone has locked themselves in the bathroom and won't open up. Let me see. Uraraka went up to the door and examined it. It was a heavy, metal door with a sturdy handle. She pressed her fingers against its surface to apply her quirk before smiling back at the red-headed hero. Well, don't stand around. Kick it in. Kirishima gave her a crooked grin. You don't have to tell me twice. He lifted a foot and smashed it against the door, sending splintered pieces of the door frame floating through the air. Uraraka waited impatiently as Kirishima gave the door another sturdy kick, breaking the deadlock and throwing it open. Uraraka released her quirk from the door and peered into the bathroom to find her prize. The villain was pressed against the opposite wall, her eyes wide with fear. You're under arrest, Uraraka recited, unable to keep the smile off her face. She made a mental note to trust her gut more often. Kirishima ducked into the room and grinned at the villain. This will be a lot less painful for all of us if you cooperate, okay? The little lady that runs the store doesn't deserve to clean up after us any more than she already does. Now, he pulled his handcuffs off his utility belt. Please put your hands behind your back. Shockingly, the villain complied. Uraraka noticed a nervous tremble in the woman's hands as Kirishima locked the cuffs in place, and she proudly helped lead her out beside Kirishima. Once they were outside, Kirishima sat her down on the curb, and Uraraka squatted down in front of her. Why did you run? The villain glared at her as Uraraka pulled the hood all the way off her head. Now that the brunette could finally get a good look at her captive, she realized she was quite young. She still looked to be a teenager. If I had to guess, Uraraka cocked her head curiously, I'd say that you haven't been running around with the Mamushi group for very long at all. You're just a beginner, aren't you? The sneer that Uraraka received after asking the question seemed to be the only answer she was going to get, but that didn't stop the brunette from asking another. What do they have you doing? Are you peddling quirking drugs, or have you already moved into helping at stash houses? You won't get anything out of me. The girl spit in Uraraka's face, and the brunette recoiled in disgust. All right, Kirishima cut in, trying to diffuse the tense conversation. He leaned down to help Uraraka up, but the brunette simply held up her hand dismissively. Do you know where Teller is? The girl immediately tensed up and looked away. The girl's reaction to her question was far different now, and both heroes picked up on it. Uraraka glanced at Kirishima for a split second before returning her gaze to the girl as she wiped the spit off her cheek. Where do we find him? Uraraka pressed. Were you the one that burned down the store? Stop, the girl shouted desperately. I won't. If I tell you anything, he'll... She seemed to choke on her words. No. Kirishima and Uraraka exchanged wary looks. This girl knew much more than she was letting on initially, so it was a promising capture. Let's get her out of here, Kirishima muttered and helped the girl to her feet. I don't like us being out here by ourselves. I agree. Let's take her back. Uraraka glanced around the street as Kirishima took the lead, pulling the girl along by the arm. Wherever there was one villain, there was usually at least one more somewhere nearby. This girl's quirk wasn't very strong or well-rounded yet, so the odds of her having a partner with a much more refined quirk were high. They couldn't afford to lose her as a lead. Once they found their way back to the burnt store, Bakugou's voice could be heard yelling angrily up ahead. What do you mean they ran off? Where the fuck did they go? We're here, Ground Zero. Kirishima waved his free hand as they began to push through the bystanders with their newly captured villain. We had a little errand to run. Bakugou finally locked his gaze on them, and his face immediately looked disgruntled. I walk away for 5 fucking minutes and miss all the action. Fucking typical. It wasn't much action. Kirishima pulled up the caution tape to allow both the villain and Uraraka to duck under it first. This little twerp didn't have much fight in her. The girl struggled against her cuffs, clearly agitated by the red-haired hero's remark. Bakugou marched up to them and glared down at her, completely unfazed by her struggles. "It took two of you to catch this little brat?" Uraraka scoffed and rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Bakugou." His eyes switched to her and softened a bit. "Who the fuck is she?" Uraraka breathed out defeatedly. "What do you mean? You don't recognize her?" "I recognize her," Bakugou replied and let his face fall into a scowl. "But that doesn't answer my question." Kirishima laughed awkwardly. All right. Let's just get her back to the police station and figure that out later." He pulled their reluctant captive away, and carried on toward a group of police officers while Bakugou and Uraraka simply watched. "So," Uraraka cleared her throat awkwardly, "do you think she's the one that did it?" Bakugou looked back at the destroyed building. "It doesn't fucking matter if she did or not. The lead is gone." "Well, we could get some information out of her." Uraraka shrugged and chanced a glance at him. When he didn't reply, she felt the tension between them grow. "How are you?" He blinked and gave her a miffed look. "What kind of question is that?" "I don't know," she sputtered with an airy laugh. "We haven't really talked very much outside of work, so I guess I was just—" "Never mind." Bakugou sighed quietly and began to adjust his right grenadier. "We're going to grill that brat until she gives up everything she knows. With any luck, we'll get something useful. I just want this fucking thing to be over with." "Me too," Uraraka mumbled back. More than anything. They glanced at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Bakugou seemed to snap out of it before she did, and his face fell back into a scowl. "It will be soon. I'll catch these sons of bitches in no time." "Not before I do." It was going to be another long night for Uraraka as she sat slumped in the tiny, cold police station. The officers had spent most of the day trying to process the girl, but they had been unable to identify her. There weren't any public records under the false name she gave the police, nor could they match her fingerprints. They hadn't even been able to find her when they ran her quirk information through their systems. Everyone was at a loss and nobody had any idea who the girl was. Uraraka watched as Ida spoke quietly with the chief of police down the hallway, and she mindlessly picked at her fingernails. She was beginning to worry that they wouldn't allow any heroes to talk to the girl until they'd been able to process her. It was mildly infuriating. "Uraraka," Ida called from down the hall and waved her over. She stood up and hurried down the hall, tossing a quick shrug at Bakugou before going around the corner with Ida. "Hey," he smiled at her. "Nice work on bringing this one in." "Of course." Uraraka accepted the praise, but her face was still serious. "What's the problem?" He casually walked with her down a tight hallway. "Well, it's the same problem we've been having all day." He stopped in front of a large window, and Uraraka could see the girl sitting inside an interrogation room, handcuffed to the table. "I just spoke with the chief, and he's agreed to let you guys talk with her." "Really?" She couldn't keep the hopeful note out of her tone. "Yeah," he nodded, but his face was still serious. "But only you for now. I also have to accompany you to protect her rights. She's still a minor after all." "What about Bakugou?" Uraraka glanced back from where they came from. "Do I really need to say it?" She couldn't really argue with that logic. Bakugou tended to be quite an intense interrogator, so she could understand why the police chief was skeptical about letting him come with her. "All right." Uraraka wiped her hands against her legs. "Let's do this. Before we go in, I need to make one thing clear." Ida started hesitantly. "This interrogation isn't about the store burning down. We need her to identify herself before we can begin interrogating her for any other crimes." Uraraka sighed. Of course there was a catch. "Can I do both?" "Look, it took a lot of convincing on my part to get the chief to agree to this at all." Ida frowned at her. "I'm trying to throw you a bone, but I have to be the one leading the interrogation." "Got it." "I promise to be good." Uraraka gave him a tired smile. "Let's go before Bakugou figures out what's going on." Ida laughed nervously before he guided her to the door. "I'm looking forward to working with you again, Uraraka. It's been a long time." "It sure has." She laughed with him as he pushed the door open, and she followed him inside. Ida was the first to speak as he crossed the room and sat down in the chair. "Hello, I'm Ingenium and I work as a consultant for the police department. This is Uravati." He motioned to the brunette as she sat down beside him. She works for the Shot agency. We just have a few questions for you. The girl sitting opposite of them scowled fiercely before she screwed up her face in disgust. I'm not telling you anything about that store. I don't know anything about it. That's fine. Ida acknowledged her with a smooth charisma that only he could present. We're not here to talk about the store. We want to talk about you. I'm not saying shit. She barked at them and pulled on the cuffs. Can't you guys take these off? They're hurting my wrists. And I want some water. Uraraka glanced at Ida as he sighed. Yeah, we can get you some water, but we can't take those off. I'm sure you can understand why. Why did you guys arrest me? I didn't even do anything wrong. She spat back at him, a cruel look in her eye. Ida scratched the back of his head and looked over at Uraraka. Well, Uravity brought you in because you ran from her. That's not a crime, the girl replied and turned her glare onto the brunette. Uraraka awkwardly cleared her throat. Well, you're only partly right about that, but... She gave Ida an apologetic look. You didn't stop when I told you to, and I've seen you coming and going from that store before. You're definitely a person of interest after what happened. I've never been to that store. What's your name? Uraraka suddenly switched the topic to appease her counterpart and avoid the touchy issue. The girl scoffed. None of your business. And you had no right to arrest me. I don't think I need to remind you that we found a bag of corking drugs in your shoe. Ida raised his eyebrows at the girl. And Uravity already had probable cause to arrest you. You're facing a possession with intent to distribute charge, young lady. And that's on top of the property damage caused from you hiding in that bathroom. Well, you wouldn't have found it if you didn't unlawfully chase me down, the girl replied scornfully. I want to leave. You can't do that, Ida shook his head. We have to identify you before we can do anything, especially before we can discuss release. Do you have a parent we can get into contact with? A relative you're living with? No. Ida's question seemed to agitate the girl even more, and she yanked her wrists against the cuffs. I don't have anyone to call. It's just me. Ida let a long pause hang in the air before he continued. Well, that's a much bigger problem then. Now we're talking about making you a ward of the state. The girl's tough demeanor seemed to crack a little bit at his newest proposition, but it didn't last longer than a second before she looked away in undignified anger. Hey. Uraraka softened her tone and leaned her elbows on the table to get a good look at the girl. Truthfully, she was quite a pretty girl with long black hair and not a single streak of makeup on her face. A naturally stunning girl. Trust me when I say that making you a ward of the state is the last thing Ida wants to do, okay? We just want to help you, but the law states that we can't just let you go. You have to have a parent or guardian here to bail you out. The girl held her gaze on the wall, but Uraraka could see her lip trembling slightly as she tried to press again. Let's just take baby steps, okay? Let's start with your name. How many times do I have to tell you idiots? I'm not giving you anything. The girl's voice cracked a little as she clearly tried to hold up her mean expression. I can't. That was something that Uraraka could work with, and she hoped that Ida wouldn't try, and butt in as she continued. You can't? How come? Because. The girl moved to throw her hands up, but the cuffs rattled loudly and kept her from doing it. Her tone was antagonizing as she dropped her wrists dejectedly. Will your parents be angry with you? Uraraka asked, keeping her tone intentionally gentle. I'm sure they're very worried about you, and they're probably wondering where you are. Huh. The girl laughed as an angry tear dripped down her cheek. I sincerely doubt that. Uraraka gave her a sympathetic look, but the girl was still staring at the wall and biting her lip hard. I understand. Sometimes parents can be difficult. The girl didn't reply, and another tear broke free. She sniffed her nose hard and refused to look at the pair of heroes across from her. You know, Uraraka started again and leaned back in her chair to give the air a feeling of shared interest. I used to work at the bombshell agency. The crime there isn't anything like it is here in Tokyo, but we had our fair share of kids that would run away from home. They all said the same thing when I asked them why they did it. Do you know what they said? The girl seemed to crack a little more, and Uraraka tried to channel every ounce of sympathetic energy she could as she watched the girl sharply shake her head. They said that their parents didn't understand them or that they didn't care about them. Ida didn't move, and he didn't dare open his mouth as he watched Uraraka go to work. Whatever the brunette heroine was doing, it was working well, and he started taking mental notes of how Uraraka handled the situation. Uraraka leaned back over the table and gave the girl a gentle look. I can't even begin to understand what you're going through right now. I wish I could, because then I could actually help you. I know it's scary to be sitting here with us, but I want you to know that we don't want to punish you. We want to help you. Please, let us try and do that. I can't, Dash, the girl's voice broke and she squeezed her teary eyes shut. There's nothing you can do to help me. Maybe not. Uraraka smiled sadly back. But how do you know that without even giving me a chance? I don't want to see you crying like this, believe me. You're so young and so pretty. And you almost got away from me with that really impressive quirk. It's Dash, the girl sniffed hard. It's not good enough. Your quirk. Uraraka asked carefully and moved her hand across the table to rest it gently on top of the girl's forearm. Yeah, she croaked back and blinked her eyes open to continue staring at the wall. It's pathetic. What? Uraraka asked in disbelief. I thought it was incredible. You know, she gave Ida a sad but humored look. That is the sort of quirk that would make a really fine hero one day. Don't you think so, Ingenium? Ida blinked back in shock before clearing his throat. Oh, certainly. I didn't get the chance to see it myself, but after Uravati told me about you, I thought the same thing. The girl finally tore her eyes away from the wall to look at them, a glimmer of hope flashing across them before it was snuffed out. A hero? I could never be a hero after this. Not that I would even want to be. That's nonsense. Uraraka met her gaze and shook her head. Trust me when I say that UA takes on any student with talent. If you work hard and want to be better, then they don't care where you came from. They just want to help in the same way I do. Do you really not want to be a hero? The girl paused for a long moment as a fat tear broke free. I can't. Uraraka felt her heart drop to her stomach. How come? Because, the girl laughed bitterly as her nose began to run. My father would lose his mind. He'd lose his mind? Uraraka blinked back in confusion. The girl sniffed hard and blinked the tears from her eyes. Of course he would. My father is Teller, the fucking accountant for the Mamushi group. She took a deep breath and put on a horribly grim expression, and he's probably on his way to get me right now. Uraraka and Ida sat with shocked expressions for a beat before Ida sharply rose out of his chair, nearly knocking it to the floor. We have to go. Wait. Uraraka started and looked up at her counterpart. What about Dash? They'll be here any minute, the girl spoke up again softly. You're all going to die. She sniffled as fresh tears began to gather in her eyes. And it's my fault. I shouldn't have gotten caught. He's going to be so angry. Ida didn't wait for Uraraka to join him before throwing open the door to the interrogation room and marching out. The first face he was met with was Bakugou's as the blonde leaned against the wall, watching the interrogation through the window with a scowl. Yeah. Bakugou spat and stepped away from the wall. Thanks for the invitation, for eyes. He sneered at the police consultant. Well, what the fuck are you standing around for? We have villains incoming. I'm staying here. Uraraka stood up and looked at the two men. I'll protect Dash, she glanced down at the girl. I guess I never really learned her name, did I? The girl met her gaze, but didn't reply. Behind the brunette, the two men departed, and Ida let the door fall shut behind him. Uraraka could hear their hurried footsteps down the hallway and faint shouting from Bakugou. Uraraka moved around the table to squat down beside the young girl. Listen, she started with a slightly pushy tone. We won't let your dad take you back if you don't want to go. So tell me right now, do you want to be a hero or do you want to be a villain? You have to decide, and you can't have both. The girl blinked at her in shock as uncertainty crossed her eyes. I want. Uraraka raised her eyebrows and nodded. All right then, let's go. So that's it for today. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. And if you want to contribute to the entire story being illustrated, just read the information in the description below.